What's up guys, it's me Jeremy. So seeing spoilers of new cards from new expansions can definitely be really exciting, and for a lot of people is one of the more fun parts of the game. Unfortunately, with Mean Streets of Gadgetzan now in full swing finally, it's gonna be a little bit of time before we get to see some new spoilers of some new cards, and maybe some of you guys are gonna be going through some spoiler season withdrawal. Fortunately though, we don't need to wait for Blizzard to release the next expansion to take a look at some more sweet and awesome cards. So despite not actually being a part of the game, fan-made cards can be really awesome to take a look at and just consider their designs. So today we're looking at another group of some fan-made legendaries, and let's get started. So first up on the list we have Sir Thomas Thompson, and oh man, I gotta say, this card is really sweet. So for 7 mana you get a 4/6 creature, and to discover a 1-cost minion that your hero power now summons instead of making a Silver Hand recruit. It's worth noting that since you can't discover cards outside of your own class, this is only going to let you discover Paladin 1-drops, or maybe 1-drops of another class if you somehow stole the Thomas Thompson or something like that, or maybe put it in your hand some other way. Now a random neutral or Paladin class 1-drop is definitely going to be better than a 1/1 creature, but it really needs to be better than 2 1-drops, since this card is pretty much fighting against Justicar honestly, They're both in the 6 to 7 mana range, and upgrading your hero power for the more grindier games. Comparing this card to potentially Justicar is definitely going to be one of the best ways to evaluate the power of Sir Thomas. So 4/6 is definitely much better stat line than a 6/3 creature, but with the extra mana tacked onto Sir Thomas, the two cards kind of even out, I guess. Maybe Sir Thomas is a little bit better stats, but as far as the abilities go, Sir Thomas is going to be a lot more varied. There's a lot of really sweet cards that you could get though, maybe like a Stone Tusk Boar for example, lets you make 1/1s with charge, or like maybe you luck out, you get an injured Cavaldir, you get a 2/4 every turn, or like a Tentacle of N'Zoth or something. Could be pretty insane. A lot of really interesting cards that you could get honestly. Maybe getting something like Weasel Tunneler off this card would be like the most hilarious thing ever. Overall though, I gotta say Justicar would probably be more consistent, and therefore honestly potentially even a better option, since in general you're usually going to get something worse than 2 1/1 minions from Sir Thomas, but as a result Sir Thomas is a really interesting and cool card, and potentially a really awesome one that I would love to see this sort of design come to the game. Next up on the list we have Old Innkeeper, which is a card that is pretty crazy but also has like a really powerful effect. So for 6 mana you get a 4/4 minion with the ability to discover what is essentially a nerfed card. Now for the sake of both balance and simplicity, we can assume that the nerfed cards are the ones that have been changed but are still in the game. Otherwise we get like this huge list of really ridiculous cards that got taken out of the game, and then this just becomes so weird and just ridiculous to play against. So okay, the stats are fine for something that's discovering a pretty okay card, but the ability isn't necessarily as overpowered as you might think. There's a lot of nerfed cards that were really strong in the deck that was built around them, but aren't particularly strong when discovered off of something like this. How much value can you get off of your pre-nerf Undertaker or a Warsong Commander that gives minions with 3 or less attack charge if you're playing Old Innkeeper in something like Reno Lock or some random mid-range control deck? The answer is probably not a ton, so even with things like pre-nerf Force of Nature, which is definitely a good card as just burst or removal, they'd definitely be much weaker without the combos that actually made them broken, like Savage Roar in the Force example of course. Now, there are definitely going to be some pretty broken cards that could be gotten off this, like the Warsong Commander that gives everything charge, or maybe the Van Cleef with Stealth, or the Tinkmaster Overspark that could target minions, but at the end of the day, most nerfs happen because of a combination of cards, and so discovering a nerf card isn't as overpowered as it sounds. Still though, Old Innkeeper is definitely a really good card, even if just for the reason that it forces the opponent to play around older versions of the cards, and it would be really cool to see this guy come to the game, but I gotta say his effect is just so complex that it's something that probably doesn't fit the style of Hearthstone. Either way, it's a really cool effect and I thought it was a fun one to take a look at. Up next we have Card Pack, which is a really interesting legendary that essentially just makes you open a pack when it dies. So this card is definitely pretty crazy, I gotta say. Even though it is pretty crazy though, other card games actually do have some similar effects. So we have Booster Tutor, which is a card in Magic the Gathering that lets you pick a card from a pack and put it into your hand, and even though it was printed in what is essentially like a joke expansion, it does sometimes get played in like fun decks and other formats. That's kind of besides the point though, Card pack makes you summon the minions and then cast the spells with random targets, which is maybe a little unfortunate since the minions that got put into play can get hit by your random spells that you're casting, or maybe you get something like Twisting Nether or something like that. Now 5 cards is a decent amount, but it's not necessarily a ton, which means not as much crazy stuff would happen compared to something like Yogg-Saron, but that also means that the level of effect that you would get from card pack is definitely going to vary a ton from activation to activation. Now obviously the effect is pretty darn powerful, so it is kind of a bit like Yogg except maybe as like a death rattle, and you're going to summon random minions instead of just some of the spells. Is it worth 10 mana though? If it was a battle cry, I could see this card seeing play, but as a death rattle, it becomes a lot worse for this type of card actually. You know, not only do you not always get to control what time this goes off, but there's always a chance of it getting polymorphed or silenced and you just get totally wrecked. Expensive death rattles don't really see all that much play, even if they're really powerful, because, you know, paying a lot of mana to not affect the board immediately is pretty rough, and losing to a silence or a sap is just something that you don't want to be able to risk. You know, Tyrion is kind of the one example, and he kind of gets around it since he has taunt in the first place, but if you're spending 10 mana developing a card pack when your opponent has a board, well, that game's definitely going to start getting really rough. Overall though, an effect like this could be pretty cool, at least fun to play with for sure, but maybe it would be something that we would want as a battle cry. As a death rattle, it's not necessarily all that powerful, although maybe that's for the better. Next up, we're looking at Mathias Sha, which is a pretty sweet rogue legendary that's really versatile and actually pretty skill testing too. So Mathias costs 5 mana and is a 6/4 minion with the ability of Battle Cry, swap attack with another minion, combo, also cast Betrayal on it. Now this is a really cool card for a couple of reasons. So first of all, swapping stats with a minion is a really interesting mechanic, and it's something that we haven't seen all that much, and I'd definitely like to see it come into the game a little bit more, especially after Vol'jin has rotated out. But it's super cool and a really versatile effect. You know, the fact that this swaps attack instead of health potentially makes it extra versatile. If your opponent's at 6 and you have a 1/1 in play, you know, maybe this card gives you lethal. If you want to shrink an opponent's minion and make Mathias bigger, you could do that. There's also a lot more though. You know, the second ability also casts Betrayal on the minion you swapped it with if you comboed Mathias. Now it's worth noting that because of the wording on Betrayal, you can't kill your own minions with this actually. So Sylvanas shenanigans are out of the question, as well as it does actually enable some potential combos with your own stuff where you know, maybe give one of your weaker minions some extra attack points or something like that. It definitely makes both you and your opponent have to worry about minion positioning and stuff, which could potentially change a lot of combat decisions throughout the course of the game. Potentially lets you get some insane value too if you set it up properly or if your opponent's not expecting it. It's also pretty cool that the first ability is like pretty strong and relevant, and sometimes you'll just use it for the first ability and you don't have to combo it, and that's okay. As opposed to like all the other combo cards where you never really want to play them ever unless you get the combo effect. And at the same time though, the combo is really powerful too, meaning that Mathias Sha could end up having tons of decisions and just really changing the course of the game and be a really cool card to play with. Overall though, I gotta say this is maybe a little overtuned. You know, he's probably a little bit too strong, but he's also really skill testing and definitely one of our favorite cards on our list today. Moving on, we're talking about Harris Pilton, which is one of the most broken cards on our list today probably, despite being just a 1/1 minion. So this card is, honestly, I gotta say, just nuts. You know, even a 2 mana 1/1 that discovers a card from your deck is actually like really broken. The thing is that you get to discover a card rather than just draw one at random, which is already a really powerful mechanic. It's better than drawing a card, to be honest. Except in this case, you know, instead of the card pool being like a certain cost or like a beast or something, it's one of the cards that you actually chose to put in your deck. And since Discover, you know, usually generates cards instead of drawing them, Harris Pilton would let you get extra copies of cards in your deck that you wouldn't normally have access to, you know. Imagine getting to play with a second Aya Blackpaw, or a second Reno, or a third Anything Can Happen. Now the legendary clause on this card is pretty cute, but not entirely super relevant. You know, you're never really building an all legendary or mostly legendary deck because those decks tend to be not so great. And even if you put this in a legendary heavy deck, say maybe like a deck that has 10 or more legendaries, the chances of getting all 3 legendaries added to your hand aren't entirely worth the deck building cost. It is potentially pretty cool with Elise, but Elise has to transform your deck before it works, so it's more about Elise RNG than anything else. Still though, this is definitely a really really awesome concept, could be pretty interesting, but the base card itself, I gotta say, is probably broken, and it would potentially need to cost a bit more mana before it could be made into a card in the future, but definitely something that's still pretty cool. And next up on our list today, we're taking a look at King Drasil. So Drasil is a 7 mana 5/5 creature, and his battle cry turns adjacent minions into 5 mana 5/5 lizards. Now, getting a net of up to 13 worth of stats for 7 mana, I gotta say, is pretty good if you assume that the adjacent minions are 0/1s, and the fact that it's split into 3 beasts as well with pretty solid stat distributions is pretty solid. Moreover, this card also really combos well with things like Unleash the Hounds, or maybe any death rattles you could trade into enemy minions and make it pop like Infested Wolf, maybe Savannah Highmane. Maybe one of the cooler things about Drasil is that you can use him to do things like transform harmful minions you control, like if you got a Doomsayer off of a Shredder or something like that if you're playing Wild, or maybe an adventure encounter where your opponent spawns and gives you harmful minions. Either way, Drasil's got some pretty sweet interactions and is a pretty cool card, although he's probably a bit too powerful for his mana cost. Overall though, would be really fun to play with. So those are some fan-made legendaries that we thought were really cool or interesting. Definitely let us know which ones were your favorites in the comments below, and definitely check out the original creators. We're going to link everything in the description and all that good stuff. And either way, it looks like that's going to be it for me. If you guys enjoyed the video, drop a like, subscribe if you want. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you guys next time.